Hello students, Professor Piggy here. Today we are marching straight into the barnyard battlefield, where security administrators defend their networks from the ever-scheming wolf. Our focus is on vulnerability scanners and penetration tests, two powerful tools that look similar at first glance, but behave very differently in practice. For your CompTIA exams, you must clearly understand that one identifies weaknesses in a passive manner, while the other actively attempts to exploit those weaknesses. A vulnerability is a weakness in a system, network, or process that could be exploited by a threat. When we reduce vulnerabilities, we reduce risk, but only if we identify and prioritize them properly. That is the purpose of a vulnerability assessment, which evaluates the overall security posture of systems and networks as part of a broader risk management strategy. It identifies weaknesses, ranks them by severity, and recommends controls to mitigate the most serious exposures. A typical vulnerability assessment begins by identifying assets and capabilities, then prioritizing those assets based on their value to the organization. Next, vulnerabilities are identified and prioritized, and finally controls are recommended to reduce risk. Assessments may include reviewing policies, analyzing logs, interviewing personnel, and performing both scans and penetration tests. Some organizations conduct assessments internally, while others hire external security professionals for independent analysis. Now let us talk about network scanners, which are tools used to gather information about hosts on a network. A popular example is Nmap, which can identify active hosts, open ports, running services, and even operating systems. Network scanners commonly perform ARP ping scans, SYN stealth scans, port scans, service scans, and operating system detection using TCP/IP fingerprinting techniques. These techniques analyze packet responses, such as TCP window sizes and protocol behavior, to infer the operating system. A port scan identifies open ports on a system, and each open port suggests a corresponding service. For example, if port 443 is open, it typically indicates HTTPS is running on that host. A service scan goes further by actively interacting with the service to verify what is actually running on that port. Operating system detection analyzes multiple packet characteristics to determine whether the system is running Windows, Linux, or another platform. A vulnerability scanner builds on this by comparing discovered systems against a database of known vulnerabilities. It identifies vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, missing patches, and absent security controls. Vulnerability scanners often rely on the common vulnerabilities and exposures list maintained by MITRE Corporation, which catalogs publicly known vulnerabilities. They also use the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, which assigns severity scores from 0 to 10 to help prioritize remediation efforts. When reviewing scan results, administrators must prioritize vulnerabilities based on classification scores, environmental context, industry impact, and organizational risk tolerance. A critical vulnerability in an online banking system is far more serious than the same vulnerability on an isolated lab machine. Risk thresholds determine which vulnerabilities must be addressed immediately and which may be temporarily accepted. They also consider the exposure factor to quantify potential asset loss if vulnerability is exploited. The wolf loves unpatched systems, but he adores poorly prioritized patch queues even more. It is important to understand that vulnerability scans are generally passive. They identify weaknesses, but do not attempt exploitation. This makes them non-intrusive and far less likely to disrupt operations. In contrast, a penetration test is intrusive because it actively attempts to exploit discovered vulnerabilities to determine their real-world impact. Scanners are not perfect, and this is where false positives and false negatives enter the pasture. A false positive occurs when a scanner reports a vulnerability that does not actually exist on the system. A false negative occurs when a vulnerability exists, but the scanner fails to detect it. A true positive correctly identifies a real vulnerability, and a true negative correctly confirms that a vulnerability is absent. Another important exam concept is credentialed versus non-credentialed scans. A credentialed scan runs with valid account credentials, often administrative, allowing deeper inspection of installed software versions and configuration settings. These scans are typically more accurate and generate fewer false positives. A non-credentialed scan runs without login credentials and shows what an external attacker would see from the outside. Configuration compliance scanners perform configuration reviews to verify that systems match approved baselines. These scans usually require credentials so they can accurately read system settings. Automation is commonly used to schedule these scans regularly. Consistent configuration validation helps ensure systems remain hardened against the wolf's clever tricks. Now we enter the more aggressive territory of penetration testing. A penetration test is an active assessment that begins with reconnaissance and proceeds to exploitation. It evaluates deployed security controls by simulating real-world attacks. Unlike vulnerability scanning, penetration testing can potentially disrupt services if not carefully controlled. Penetration tests may be physical, offensive, defensive, or integrated. Physical tests attempt to bypass physical security controls such as locked doors or badge systems. Offensive tests simulate attacker behavior to identify exploitable weaknesses. Defensive tests focus on evaluating and strengthening existing security controls. Integrated tests combine multiple approaches for comprehensive evaluation. Before any testing begins, rules of engagement must be defined in writing. Authorization protects testers from legal consequences and ensures that testing boundaries are clear. Without consent, a penetration test is indistinguishable from an attack. Even Professor Piggy would be trotting toward the unemployment line if he tested without approval. Reconnaissance is the first phase of penetration testing. Passive reconnaissance gathers information using open-source intelligence without directly interacting with the target. Active reconnaissance engages the target using scanning tools. Passive methods are generally legal because they do not directly interact with the target, while active methods require explicit authorization. Tools used in reconnaissance include Nmap, Netcat for banner grabbing, Nessus for vulnerability scanning, and Curl for retrieving web data. These tools help testers identify hosts, services, DNS records, and potential vulnerabilities. Footprinting provides a broad overview of the network, while fingerprinting identifies specific details about individual systems. After identifying vulnerabilities, testers may attempt initial exploitation to gain access. Once inside, they may establish persistence by creating backdoors or additional accounts. Lateral movement allows them to move from one compromised system to others. Privilege escalation techniques increase their access rights, and pivoting uses one compromised system as a launching point to access additional systems. Testing environments are classified as unknown, known, or partially known. Unknown environment testing, often called black box testing, provides testers with no prior knowledge. Known environment testing, or white box testing, provides full documentation and access. Partially known environment testing, sometimes called gray box testing, provides limited information. Cleanup is essential after a penetration test. Testers must remove accounts, scripts, tools, and configuration changes introduced during testing. Responsible disclosure programs allow researchers to report vulnerabilities so organizations can address them before exploitation occurs. Bug bounty programs incentivize researchers to identify and report valid vulnerabilities. Finally, once vulnerabilities are identified, organizations must respond. The preferred remediation method is applying patches provided by vendors. If patches are unavailable, compensating controls such as segmentation or web application firewalls may be used. After remediation, systems must be rescanned to validate that the vulnerability no longer exists, and documentation should be updated accordingly. Students, remember this clearly for your exam and your future careers. Vulnerability scans are typically non-intrusive and identify weaknesses without exploitation, while penetration tests are intrusive and attempt to exploit vulnerabilities to determine impact. When the wolf prowls at the edge of the network, it is preparation, prioritization, and proper testing that keep our barn secure. If this lesson strengthened your security snout and sharpened your defensive tusks, be sure to like and subscribe for more cybersecurity wisdom from your favorite professor. Oink!